American crime, thriller, and drama movie called The Devil All the Time. Willard Russell and his family live in the remote area of Knokenstift, Ohio. However, the family seems to be shunned by the other neighbors simply because they seem so religious. Several years ago, Willard put an old cross in his backyard which he visits every morning to pray. Every time he prays, his mind always drifts back to his past during the World War, which happened 12 years ago. When he serves as a soldier in the Solomon Islands, Willard finds Sergeant Miller Jones's body was skinned and crucified by Japanese soldiers, but it turns out that the sergeant is still not dead. Therefore, he ends Jones' agony by shooting him in the back of the ear. On his way home from the war, Willard stops first in Meade, Ohio, where he meets his future wife, Charlotte Russell, who works as a waitress at that time. Besides that, there is also a photographer named Carl Henderson who is in love with Sandy, another waitress in the restaurant. Afterwards, Willard is picked up by his uncle, Erskine. On their way home, Willard gives his uncle a gift in the form of a Luger pistol which he got during the war against the Germans. Arriving home, Willard is greeted by his mother, Emma, who is also very religious. She is greatly relieved when she finds that her son has returned home safely from the war. In fact, she secretly promised to God that if his son returns safely, she will set him up with a woman named Helen. However, Helen actually likes Roy, an evangelical preacher in her church, and also the man she will marry in the future. He is very fanatical about his religion, even pouring venomous spiders over his head in the belief that God will help him miraculously. Once, Emma thinks about what will happen if she breaks her promise to God. On the other hand, Willard keeps thinking of Charlotte as his lover. Long story short, the two eventually marry and have an only son named Arvin Russell before moving into their present home in Ohio. From then on, Willard feels the presence of God in his backyard, so he places a wooden cross there. At his mother's house, Emma, who now lives with Erskine, is suddenly visited by Helen. She wants to leave his daughter, Lenore, because she wants to go around with Roy in his car. However, it is actually Helen's last day to meet with her child. In other words, there will be no sign of life from Helen and Roy the day after. Helen's body was found buried in the forest 7 years later, while Roy's whereabouts is still unknown. One day in 1957, Willard notices that Arvin's face is often bruised after returning from his school. Because of that, he feels very annoyed and tells his son that he should be more courageous against the bullies at his school. Willard then takes Arvin, who is now 9 years old, to pray in the backyard. However, their activities are interrupted by the two hunters who suddenly insult them, saying that they are very strange. Even though Willard is very angry with the hunters, he still manages to calm himself down and continues to pray with Arvin. After that, Willard takes Arvin to buy gas, but instead they go to the residence of the two hunters earlier. Without further ado, he immediately beats up the hunters while teaching his son that revenge against the bullies must be done at the right time. When they get home, Arvin is shocked to find his mother lying unconsciously on the floor. Apparently, Charlotte is diagnosed with malignant cancer by the doctor. Realizing his wife's incurable illness, Willard keeps on bringing Arvin to pray in the backyard, hoping that God will heal Charlotte's illness. They spend the day constantly praying fervently to God until Willard thinks that God might need more than just fervent prayer. Therefore, he sacrifices Arvin's beloved dog, kneeling before the cross in the backyard. However, the cancer has to take Charlotte's life despite their efforts. Not only that, Arvin later finds his father commits suicide by slitting his wrist due to depression. Arvin, now an orphan, goes to live with his grandmother, who greets him well just like when she greeted his father home from the war. He then meets Erskine and Lenore, who becomes his adopted stepsister. Back 7 years earlier when Helen is still living happily with her family, Roy has been locking himself in the cupboard for 2 weeks. He is waiting for an answer from God for the trials he's facing now because previously his face was bitten by a spider and his face became swollen. Surprisingly, it is also revealed that Roy is the one who kills Helen after they entrust their child to Emma. He does this because he believes that God has granted grace for him to have the ability to resurrect the dead. Unfortunately, he ends up burying his wife in the forest after failing to resurrect her. After that, he escapes his hometown with his paralyzed cousin. However, Roy suddenly realizes that he really loves his family after being advised by his cousin. Therefore, he leaves his paralyzed cousin alone in the car and attempts to return to pick up Lenore. Roy then decides to hitch a ride in someone's vehicle. Unexpectedly, he is later picked up by Carl and Sandy, who kindly give him a ride. At that time, Roy feels really tired and falls asleep in the car. When he wakes up, he is surprised to find themselves in a deserted forest near the lake. Moreover, Carl forces Roy to make out with his own wife while he takes the photographs. Roy, who is a preacher and very fanatical about God, undoubtedly refuses to do so. However, Carl eventually shoots and kills him anyway. Even after Roy's death, Carl still takes the photograph of his wife next to Roy's dead body. Everything that just happened revealed that the couple are serial killers. In 1965, Emma, Erskine, and Leonard are celebrating Arvin's birthday. Erskine then gives Arvin back his father's Luger pistol as a birthday present. Meanwhile, Leonard, who grows up in a religious family, is also bullied by some local greasers. Fortunately, Arvin is fiercely protective of her, whom he cares for like his own sister, even though he gets sometimes beaten back by the bullies. After school, Arvin always accompanies Lenora to visit her mother's grave. At the same time, the local preacher calls both of them and says that he will be away from the town for some time. Thus, his nephew, who has just finished Bible colleges, will take his place temporarily. The preacher also demands them to tell this info to their grandmother, so that their grandmother will serve the new preacher with a delicious meal for the next sermon. He already knows that Emma's cooking is the best in town. When the day of the next sermon arrives, the residents bring their own dishes for the new preacher named Preston T. Garden. However, as he tastes all the dishes, he humiliates Emma's cooking instead, saying that the plates she used are terrible, including the food as well. Therefore, he wants to sacrifice himself to eat Emma's poor dishes while the others can eat her delicious food. Emma bursts into tears after being so disappointed with his statement. Because of this, Arvin is also very mad with Preston, thinking that he just wanted to eat Emma's delicious dishes all for himself. Luckily, he is stopped by Emma before scolding the new preacher. When Arvin picks up Lena at her school the next day, he sees his sister being bullied again by the local greasers as always. He then takes Lena to her mother's grave, but this time Arvin does not accompany her like usual. He goes back to the school instead. It turns out that he wants to attack and beat all of the bullies mercilessly while remembering his father's words for revenge at the right time. Meanwhile, heavy rain falls as Leonard prays for her mother, prompting her to take shelter in the church. She then meets Preston and uses the time to confide her problem of being bullied at school. Therefore, Preston takes her to pray for the problem in a quiet place. He also says that God will be pleased if Leonard wants to offer her body while they are undressing together in the car. 3 months later, in the city of Meade, Ohio, Sandy plans to run away from Carl because she is bored with her activities as a psychopath with his husband. However, she gives up her intention and decides to come back home. The next morning, she is suddenly visited by a police officer named Lee. He is the one who helped Arvin the night when he lost his father. Lee asks her not to mess around for a while, as he will be running in the next election. Before he leaves the house, it is revealed that Sandy is actually his sister, suggesting that he's a dirty cop who has been covering up all of his sister's psychopathic actions. The psychopathic couple keeps carrying out their usual activities, and this time they get a young soldier who is taken to the deserted forest before being killed by the couple. It turns out that Carl gets satisfaction after killing his victims, but not for Sandy, especially this time because of her boredom. Therefore, she ends up reporting the incident to the military center that night. Back to Arvin's family, Leonard looks sick and vomits continuously at home until she learns that she is pregnant. When she informs Preston about her pregnancy, he denies her, stating that she is being delusional, not wanting to bring shame to her family, especially her grandmother. Leonard plans to take her own life by hanging herself. Fortunately, she decides not to go through with suicide at the last second, realizing that she has made the wrong choice. However, as she tries to undo the noose, she accidentally slips off her support and dies in that state. Shortly after, Arvin is the first person to find her body. Sadly, no one comes to her funeral and prays for her because of Preston's sermon that those who commit suicide are not worthy of prayer. In the evening, Arvin is informed by the sheriff of his sister's forensic results, showing that she was pregnant. Hearing this, he immediately suspects that Preston was the father because he was quite close to Lenora. Since then, he has been stalking Preston from afar and tracking all of his activities. One day, Arvin sees him seducing another underage girl. With all this evidence, he intends to seek revenge on Preston. Before that, he also says goodbye to his great-uncle and grandmother if he later becomes a fugitive. The following morning, Arvin starts to fully load his pistol and goes to the church pretending to confess all of his sins. In the end, he confronts Preston about Lenora and wants him to confess everything he did to her. However, the The preacher belittles his words, making Arvin even more furious before shooting him dead. After that, he escapes from the place and decides to return to his childhood home in Knockenstift. Arvin intends to fix everything about his father, which has been considered a burden on his heart. Unluckily, his car breaks down in the middle of the trip, so he is forced to seek a ride from another car. Coincidentally, the psychopathic couple is crossing the street looking for their next victim. On their journey, Arvin unintentionally notices that Carl is carrying a gun. As Carl begins his actions, Arvin shoots and kills both Carl and Sandy in self-defense. In the car's glove compartment, he finds a collection consisting of several rolls of film of their murder and takes them as evidence to the police. A few days later, Lee finally learns about Sandy's murder and comes to the scene. However, instead of feeling sad, he thinks more about his good name and position until he remembers the photo which he found at Sandy's house. To protect himself in his upcoming election, he goes to Sandy's apartment where he finds and burns Carl's photo collection to eliminate evidence of his sister's crimes. Soon, Arvin arrives at his childhood home. He then meets with the old man who had previously helped him along with Lee when he was a child. Arvin finally learns that Sandy is actually Lee's sister. On the other side, he continues his investigation and finds a match between the murders of Preston and his sister. He has discovered that the murderer is Arvin, a young boy he had previously helped. Meanwhile, Arvin begins to understand of all his father's actions in the past and eventually forgives all his father's mistakes. After a while, he suddenly hears the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. It turns out to be Lee, who has tracked him to Knockenstift, armed with a shotgun. He then confronts Arvin in the woods while Arvin explains the reason he killed them all because they were very bad persons. A shootout ensues, but luckily Lee's shot is blocked by a tree while Arvin manages to shoot Lee in the stomach with his pistol. Before Lee dies, Arvin shows Lee the photo of Sandy with Roy's dead body. He then leaves the evidence in Lee's pocket, so Carl and Sandy's serial killing spree can be exposed. After that, Arvin starts his journey by hitchhiking again, but now he is picked up by a hippie. As he rides in the passenger seat and exhausted, Arvin struggles to stay awake, especially after going through all the hard stuff. Therefore, he daydreams and contemplates all the possibilities that could happen to him in the future, such as being forgiven for what he has done, becoming the husband of the woman of his dreams, or serving in the Vietnam War like his father did. The film ends with Arvin, who cannot hold his sleep anymore, fast asleep in the car. Thank you for watching this video. If you want more video like this, then please like, share, and subscribe.